the people in the back who would like to take their seats. We would appreciate that so we could stay on schedule here.
Are you taking the bullets on this?
Thank you all for your continued patience and continuing to take the time through the day. We started hearing a little bit about teacher reform in a variety of different ways in Indiana with Dr. Bennett just a few moments ago. And that leads us perfectly into our next presentation from Sandi Jacobs. She's the Vice President at the National Council of Teacher Quality. She's a 4th and 5th grade teacher at Public School 9 in Brooklyn, New York. So she is more than capable to talk about what it's like in the classroom and was actually a Charter Corps member of Teach for America. So once again, please encourage you guys to ask questions. Nothing is too hard. With that, Sandi Jacobs.
Thank you. So I know it's been a long, oh, that's a little feedback. Is that better? Okay. If I see I'm going to use this one. We're going to make this one work because that was awful, and I know it's late in the day and you needed a wake up, but it's not that constantly for the next half hour. It's not going to work well. So good afternoon. It is a pleasure to be here. I am going to talk about teacher quality. I am with the National Council on Teacher Quality. We are a non-partisan, nonprofit research and policy group based in Washington, D.C. We have a silly name because we're not a council, we're not a membership organization. I get asked all the time who our members are, and we don't have any members because we're not that kind of group, although our name would suggest otherwise. But we do focus entirely on policy and issues with the goal of advancing the teaching profession and making sure that all kids have highly effective teachers. We focus primarily on the 4 big entities that we think are the big players in terms of teacher policy, and they are states, sort of the intersection between teachers' unions and local school districts and teacher preparation programs. Based on some of the earlier comments, you might be pleased to see that we don't have the federal government on that list. In terms of teacher policy, we just don't see the feds as a very big player. Race to the top changed that dynamic a little bit. But both past and moving forward, really the states are where the action is in terms of teacher policy. We have seen over the last really decade a real change in the conversation from talking about what qualifications a teacher should bring into the classroom with her to whether or not teachers are effective once they're in the classroom. And that conversation is really starting to change. And what's driving that is a real strong convergence of research showing just how important teacher quality is. And several people already have made reference to the fact that we can see plain as day from a variety of research studies across disciplines, across study designs, that of the things in the school building, nothing matters more to student achievement than the quality of the teacher. And, oops, again, did just what I was warned not to do. So I just put this quote from President Obama just to show what a bipartisan issue this has become. Now, there's not everybody in both parties supporting issues around teacher quality, but we have a Democratic administration, very, very strongly speaking to issues that a big part of their base, the teachers' unions, are not so pleased about. So I always like to get started with this illustration just to put a very fine point on teacher quality. What this graph shows you, now you might look at this and say, the achievement gap. Well, so here is the achievement gap. Well, this isn't really what we traditionally think of as the achievement gap. Because the achievement gap, starts from the fact that our most disadvantaged kids start school already disadvantaged, right? And that gap just widens and widens and widens. But what we see here is kids that are at the same starting point in 3rd grade, right? These aren't kids just starting school. These are kids on track in their first years of schooling. They reach the 3rd grade at grade level. Some of those kids, over the next 3 years, have the best teachers, the most effective teachers. This is from value-added data in Tennessee, where they divided the teachers into quintiles. So these are kids who have the top 20% of teachers for the next 3 years. And the other kids from that same starting point had the bottom 20% teachers for the next 3 years. And a huge gap opens up. This is why we are talking about teacher quality and why teacher policy needs to be so high on our education reform agenda. So one of the things my organization does is we put out an annual state teacher policy yearbook where we have a reform framework of a set of goals that we think are what states should be doing across all areas of teacher policy. How teachers are prepared, how they're licensed, how they're evaluated, how they're compensated, how they're exited when they're found to be ineffective, the strategies that are used to retain those that are effective. And we grade each state against this rubric. The last time we did a comprehensive edition where we gave grades was in 2009, and our next report will be out this January. We don't believe in grading on a curve. We call them like we see them. And the average grade we gave in 2009 was a big fat D, which states though. And the overall grade for Kansas was even a little below that average at a D minus. And just to put an interesting note on things, so we send out the draft to states to review to make sure, if we have something wrong, if we've misinterpreted something or missed something, we want states to correct us. And we also publish the state's responses within the published document. And in 2009, when we sent out the drafts, it turned out Florida was the highest scoring grade, the highest scoring state with a C, right? Nothing really to cheer too much about, but compared to D's and F's, I guess it's a step ahead. But when we send the drafts out, the states don't see their grades. They just see the information that we've collected and analyzed. And Eric Smith in Florida called me as soon as he got that draft and said, when can you come here and present this to my board? Because I want them to hear about every area where we're not doing as well as we could be. And once we published the reports, and they came out, and Indiana got something in the D range, and Tony Bennett called soon after to say, when can you come present this to my board so they can hear about what we need to work on. So we've heard today from two just incredible leaders who have really taken up the issue of teacher quality in such a significant way. So just to show a little bit more about Kansas, we, in our review, look at 5 different areas, and you can see how Kansas compares to the state average. In particular, there's real weaknesses in terms of expanding the teaching pool, which has to do with alternative certification. I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. And in policies for exiting ineffective teachers, a particular area of weakness. And we'll talk more about all of these things as we go on. So, hearing about Indiana, we've been hearing about Florida. What does it look like across the states, and how does Kansas compare? As I said, we see real movement for the first time in a long time toward making sure that state policies reflect teacher effectiveness. And this is really a big change, because when we look at most state policy, or in these states from just a couple of years ago, not only wouldn't you find much connection between any of these areas and effectiveness, but you wouldn't find much connection between these areas and each other. State teacher policy tends to exist in a total silo, where none of the parts are very coordinated together. They're not part of an overall structure or an overall strategy designed to make sure that kids have effective teachers. Things evolved over time, their own little courses for their own reasons. So that's why we find, tenure, which occurs at the district level, and relicensure, which occurs at the state level. But shouldn't they be based on similar evidence? They're not based in general on any evidence, but they're not even coordinated in terms of when they occur and how they occur. Evaluation ratings don't connect to decisions about compensation or tenure or anything else for that matter, because it just all exists in its own little universe. And so when you see bills like Tony showed that start to connect these pieces together, it's not just big change that it's focusing on effectiveness, but it's a big change in that it's these attempts to really coordinate these things that absolutely have to feed off each other and go together. So what does this look like across states? In terms of the bottom line, if you ask me, you know, what one thing should every state make sure its teacher policy ensures, to me, it's that teacher evaluations consider teacher effectiveness. It sounds like a no-brainer, right? But that's not at all what we've had. And by teacher effectiveness, I mean whether or not students are learning in that classroom. If you went around to districts and not to pick on Kansas, in Kansas or almost any place else right now, and looked at their evaluation instrument, the thing that they use to evaluate teachers, you would find almost a complete absence of whether or not kids are learning. Most places use a checklist approach, where an observer comes into a classroom, maybe just once, maybe just for a few minutes, maybe not, it can't be unannounced, that they have to come at a scheduled time, and they're looking for some set of things. And what we see most is these things focus on, are the bulletin boards attractive? Are the kids, you know, quiet and orderly, which may mean that they're engaged, or may mean that they're completely disengaged, they're just quiet. I've seen a checklist from a very large urban district, Los Angeles, that has on its checklist teacher hygiene. So if you smell okay that day, you're going to get a satisfactory evaluation. So we now see that 12 states specifically require that teacher evaluation will make sure that nothing counts more than evidence of student learning. So that's not to say it's the only thing that goes into the evaluation, but it's the thing that counts most. We also see, and I actually can't believe this number every time I look at this because it was so different just a year ago and certainly 2 years ago, that 28 states now require some inclusion of student achievement data. So I can't remember exactly who asked the question of Tony in our last session, but about finding that balance between the objective data and the subjective data. I don't know anybody who advocates for reform of teacher evaluation and for making sure that it's based on evidence of student learning who thinks that standardized tests should be the only measure of teacher performance. I don't know anybody anywhere in the country who advocates for that. It's a very important measure, and we should use that data where we have that data, but it absolutely has to be balanced with other measures, with other objective measures, so that the standardized test data aren't standing alone, but also with subjective measures, what is going on in that classroom, because we need to be able to give teachers feedback on their practice so that they can continue to develop their skills. Only 35 states currently require classroom observations to be part of teacher evaluation. We've seen places where your evaluation is not rated, does not include anything having to do with student performance, and it really doesn't have to do anything with teacher performance either. It's a conference that's conducted in the principal or assistant principal's office, where it's a discussion of what's gone on this year. Oh, you were really helpful at the PTA fundraiser, and how that unit you were doing on dinosaurs go for you this year. This just isn't the way we're going to make sure that we get good results from our kids. In terms of a place where there's the biggest state role in moving this forward, is states need to have a data system that has the capacity to generate the kind of growth or value-added data that can be used for teacher evaluation. No matter how much local control is given in evaluation systems, it's crazy to think that each district should have to build its own data system and build its own growth model when that data comes from the state test. And as part of No Child Left Behind and other federal requirements, states have had to build these data systems, so the underlying capacity is there. Kansas is one of a relatively small number of states that have the full capacity to generate that kind of data. It's not doing it, but it could, and that's a good sign. Lots of states, as you can see, nearly all the states have the building blocks. They have the student identifier and they have the teacher identifier. But the key thing is that those two things can talk to each other. And there's only 20 states, including Kansas, that currently have that capability. In terms of frequency of evaluation, we look at the differences in policy for new teachers, for probationary teachers, and then for non-probationary teachers. Pretty much all states require new teachers to have at least one evaluation. Kansas actually requires 2. And what we realize, there's a bit of a nomenclature issue here, because as we move towards data-based evaluations, it isn't really possible to have multiple evaluations a year. What we really mean is that they're having multiple observations a year, right? That they're being looked at more than once. And that's right. I mean, you especially want to make sure that our new teachers are getting looked at early in the year. You don't want to find out in May that poor Miss Smith didn't know what she was doing for the last 10 months. And we found that out in May because I had to complete my paperwork, and so I finally made it into Miss Smith's classroom to find out, yeesh, she needed a lot of help that she never got. But in terms of veteran teachers, Kansas requires teacher evaluation once every 3 years. That is a pretty long time to go without even being looked at. And so remembering everything I just said about these evaluations likely aren't even considering student performance, maybe only looking at the most tangentially related things to teacher performance, and to only occur every 3 years, what that adds up to is really not having any idea whether teachers are effective or not. I can't imagine doing my job and getting an evaluation every 3 years. Certainly private industry wouldn't stand for that as well. The key thing, Tony talked a lot about how under attack teachers feel right now, and how much they feel that they're being blamed, and that the conversation has gotten very adversarial and very ugly. Part of it is, the purpose of an annual evaluation, I don't consider my performance evaluation that I get each year as an opportunity, that my boss is looking for an opportunity to fire me. Right? I just don't worry about that. Now, she could, if that might be the outcome, but the purpose is to talk about performance and to get the development you need to do even better next year, right? And we have to make sure that's the message we're giving teachers about the purpose of evaluation. We don't do any better job identifying our outstanding teachers than we do identifying those truly awful performers. And we need to be able to do both. We also need to be able to identify everybody in between so that we can give them that feedback and help them develop. And we have to make sure that that is part of the conversation. We're not advocating for annual evaluations so that we can fire lots and lots of teachers. Some might get fired, right? Because, as Tony said, some are going to be bad and you want to do something about it. But the point is to have information about your performance so that you can continue to do better. So this graph, every time I look at it, it newly amazes me, because 2 years ago this graph was 51 and 0. And then when we talked about tenure, we decided to scan and look for any state that had anything on the books that remotely could be interpreted as not awarding tenure automatically at the completion of a certain number of years. And we found 4 states that by that crazy extended definition did something. That something happened. It wasn't a completely automatic process, even though what they did wasn't very much. And now, in just the last 2 years, 7 states now connect tenure decisions to evidence of student learning, and another 5 states make sure that there is a real consideration of evidence. So this is just, I don't know that there's an area like tenure that was so strongly considered an immovable object, right? This is a sacred cow. We can never change tenure policy. It is what it is. We can maybe wish it was something different, but it just simply cannot be changed. And now we see that just in the last year and a half, 12 states have already taken very significant measures. In terms of how long before a teacher earns tenure, so one thing that goes hand in hand with making sure that tenure decisions are meaningful is making sure that you have a long enough period of time to collect good evidence on which to base that decision. If you're making that decision too early, you're not going to make good decisions. And what we see is that pretty much all the states, Kansas is among the many, many states that have a 3-year probationary period. 3 years just doesn't seem long enough to have good evidence of teacher performance. We know that most new teachers are not as good as they're going to be, right? The first year is a very hard year to judge teacher performance based on. If we wait to the second year, we get better data. But generally, we don't have that data until the following year. So if you're making tenure decisions at the 3-year mark, you're probably making it only on 2 years worth of data. And that first year isn't very meaningful. So in terms of making this decision of who is going to get these additional due process rights, we're not making it very meaningful, even if we have good law that says we are going to make meaningful decisions, but we have to make sure we have enough time to do it. Now, I have to say that longer probationary period is more fair to teachers, too. You have to convince them of that. It doesn't sound more fair on the surface. It just makes them sound like you're extending their probationary period. But if you're going to make a hard decision based on performance, if you make it at the 3-year mark, the odds are you're going to not grant tenure to some teachers who might turn out to be perfectly good because that first year's data is weighing so heavily. So that extended period is in everybody's best interest. It's in the district's best interest and the teachers as well. So looking at professional licensure, so this is where pretty much all states start teachers out with a probationary license and then move them within a couple of years to a professional license. In most states, this is an automatic process that is either connected to just fulfilling a certain amount of time or fulfilling a certain amount of seat time requirements. What Tony was saying about the ATM at the university, go pay them your $600 and get your 3 credits, well, that's because you need it to be able to renew your license, even though that coursework may have absolutely it wasn't me. Absolutely nothing to do with your actual instruction. Tony also talked about advanced degrees, right? We know that most teachers pursue an advanced degree because it's the only way to move up the salary schedule, or because it's required for professional or advanced licensure, even though the research evidence couldn't be more compelling that these degrees do not make teachers any more effective. And when you first hear that, it's a little bit of a head scratcher. Shouldn't studying something more in depth make you more effective in the classroom? Like, it just seems to be such a disconnect there. But what we see is that most teachers do not pursue a master's degree in a field that's even connected to their practice. They don't study their content more in depth if they're a secondary teacher. Out of only about a quarter of secondary teachers get their advanced degree in their content area. Only about less than 10% of elementary teachers get an advanced degree in their content area. Now, what do they get them in? Well, the major thing they get them in is administration, because they plan to move themselves along the principal pipeline, which is in most cases, self-selected. And even if they don't pursue being an administrator, they'll still get the pay bump for having got that advanced degree. They also get advanced degrees in these generic curriculum and instruction programs, which are not focused on specific subject areas, so therefore they don't connect to teachers' individual practice. But we now see 3 states that say, you want to renew your license in this state? You're going to have to show that you were effective through a rigorous evaluation system, through evidence that's connected to student learning. And finally, here looking at do states specify that ineffectiveness is grounds for dismissal. So one thing that I find puzzling is that pretty much every state has on the books the specific grounds for which a teacher can be fired. And it's not, generic labor law about protection of rights. It's specific to firing teachers. And performance is almost never specified in these laws. They talk about felony convictions, morality violations. California's law says that you can't be a communist or a member of a criminal syndicate. I've seen another state that says you can't have tuberculosis, but nothing that says we're going to fire you because you just weren't any good at this job. And what we do see is we see these euphemisms placed in, like inadequacy or inefficiency or incompetence. Well, if I showed up every day and tried to do the job, was I inefficient or inadequate or incompetent? It's open to interpretation, right? So what we've now seen is that 9 states have moved to specifically shore this up and make sure it's clear that not getting the job done in the classroom in terms of student learning is now specifically grounds for dismissal. And that's not to say that it means that the state is saying, under these circumstances, this teacher is fired, right? That's a local decision, that's a district decision. But the state is making it clear that that teacher is eligible for dismissal under those circumstances. So just to sum up, just so you can see how much change has occurred in the last 2 years, and without a doubt, the Race to the Top competition was the catalyst for getting this started. We've been tracking state policy since 2007, and 2007, 2008, 2009 didn't look too different from year to year. But starting in 2009, this is a huge change. But what has amazed me is the extent to which the changes have continued in 2011, and every reason to think they'll continue in legislative sessions in 2012, because showing that this is not just about a money grab, a money chase, trying to be competitive. Once the dominoes have started to fall on areas that were considered immovable, non-starters in terms of policy changes, states have really run with it and continued to move. So to show you some of the other things that we've seen, in terms of alternative certification, so only 5 states offer what we call a genuine alternate route. What many states do, pretty much every state, North Dakota is the only state that doesn't have something on the books that they call an alternate route to certification. But what we tend to see is what most states have on the books falls at one extreme or the other. At the one extreme, they look almost entirely like traditional teacher preparation programs. You have to do pretty much the exact same amount of coursework, there's nothing streamlined about it. But they'll let you teach while you're doing that full preparation coursework. That's not what alternative certification is supposed to be. It's supposed to be a streamlined way to get talented people into the classroom. The other end of the spectrum, what we see is states basically renaming emergency licenses as alternative certification. So we'll let anybody in, and then they go fulfill some requirements and we'll eventually call you a teacher. Well, neither of these things are true to the real intent of alternative certification. Kansas, I have to say, what Kansas has on the books looks more like that thing over here. In particular, Kansas is, before a district can hire an alternatively certified teacher in Kansas, they have to certify that they, I forget the exact terminology, something like exhausted all reasonable exhausted all reasonable searches to find a traditionally certified teacher. So clearly sending the message that it's not a way to bring an additional talented pipeline in it, right? It's how we're going to stick somebody in a classroom with a license when we can't find anybody else. So that really needs a very systematic rethink. Another major obstacle that states place on their alternative routes is requiring that teachers can only teach a subject area that they have a major in. Now, you have somebody who's, a career changer, who's an expert in a subject, but maybe didn't study it as an undergrad, and you're suggesting they should go back and take undergrad coursework, or there's a better way to get at whether or not this person knows their subject matter. Give them a rigorous test. If they pass the test, there's no reason not to let them teach. I mean, we've heard examples from all over the country of, college-level instructors who want to teach at the elementary level, essentially being told they have to take coursework that they taught themselves at the college level in order to get an alternative license. Someone who's a chemical engineer for 20 years and wants to teach high school chemistry, but didn't major in chemistry, and go take additional undergrad coursework before we'll let you teach it. So that's something really significant to think about. In terms of elementary teacher preparation, for the nuts and bolts are reading and math. An increasing number of states have good requirements on the books to make sure that teachers know effective reading instruction, but only 6 states have a test that backs that up, and Kansas is not one of them. And Massachusetts is the only state that requires elementary teachers to pass a extremely rigorous test of their knowledge of elementary content math. What we have found with we know that math phobia starts early in kids, and especially in girls. And that has a lot to do with the math phobia of their teachers. We ask elementary teachers to teach all subjects, and a lot of teachers are not well prepared in math, and I'm going to show you more in a second about that. But what we tend to do at the college level is we either require prospective elementary teachers to take lots of college level math. Well, that's not preparing them for the elementary classroom. Or we require them just methods, how to teach that elementary math, but we don't require coursework that requires them to really delve into that elementary math, but not at an elementary level. And if you take a look at Massachusetts' test, which they have a full sample test on their website, you see, well, this is tough stuff, but it's not tough. It's not tough in that it's calculus. It's tough in that you cannot fake your way through without really knowing this math and knowing it at such a deep level that you're then very well prepared to teach it. The other mistake we make with our elementary tests is, and this is Kansas and most other states, we use a composite score for teacher licensure tests. So a teacher who maybe is very weak in math does well enough in the English section and the social studies section and the science section that they could get pretty much every math question wrong and still pass the test. And contributing to this is this little graph, which is kind of a stunner. So we looked at the required passing scores for, this is the elementary licensure test, the content test. Pretty much every state sets its cut score at least a full standard deviation below the mean. What that means is they're setting the cut score, this includes Kansas, at around the 16th percentile. Some states are setting it 2 standard deviations below the mean, which is the 2nd percentile. Why would you even bother giving the test if all you have to do to pass it? Who are we screening out if the passing score is at the 2nd percentile? Now, Massachusetts, you may notice, is a real exception here. remember, I just described to you how much harder Massachusetts' test is than everybody else's, and they're setting the cut score so much higher than everybody else's. Now, I don't know about you, but I haven't read a lot of headlines that talk about the massive teacher shortages in Massachusetts. Whenever you talk about raising cut scores, the pushback you hear is, we'll have shortages, we'll have shortages, we'll have shortages. In the only state that has made a significant attempt to increase their requirements here, that those shortages have just not materialized. Let's also remember that this is looking at elementary, right? Generally, where we hear about shortages, it's not that elementary teachers are in short supply. So why are we setting the cut scores at around the 16th percentile? Okay, so looking at middle school preparation, this is an area where Kansas is ahead of many, many states, because too many states allow middle school teachers to teach on a K-8 license. Kansas does not permit that. This K-8 license drives me crazy. The notion that teaching first grade science and teaching 8th grade science are the same thing, that it's the same preparation you need to do that, just seems nuts. You can see, certainly there are schools that are still organized on a K-8 model, and that's fine. If that building can be organized that way, it doesn't mean you can't demand that teachers actually know the subject matter and the pedagogy appropriate to the grade that they're teaching. Okay, this is one where I really have to climb on my soapbox. This has become a pet, really, issue for me. Almost every state offers K-12 special education certification, right? If you think that K-8 middle school certification doesn't make any sense, think about K-12 preparation for, and I'm not talking about kids with severe cognitive disabilities, right? Because that might make sense to have a K-12 certification. We're talking about learning disabled kids who are expected to reach the same standards as typical kids. They're expected to pass the same tests, know the same content, and meet the same expectations. Yet we think a first grade teacher and a 11th grade teacher are interchangeable for these kids by putting them on the same license. This is such an anachronistic, completely out of date match for special education, right? This comes from a time when the idea of special education was simply a containment model. We're going to put all the kids in a room, and at the end of next year, we'll come back and do it again, right? Not the idea that kids could learn and achieve. Kansas, at least, doesn't only offer a K-12 special ed license, which some states, that is the only thing that they offer. But there are a growing number of states, it's about a dozen now, and I hope this number will continue to grow, that won't offer this K-12 license anymore. I think we do such a disservice to some of our most vulnerable kids by continuing to offer this license. Okay, I'm done on my soapbox. In terms of strategies for teacher retention, so one thing, if you think back to the grades that I showed you at the beginning of my presentation, what we see is that states are putting more energy into these retention strategies than they're putting into these strategies to identify who's effective and who's not. And it's the cart before the horse, because if you're putting money into retention, don't you want to make sure you're retaining the people you want to retain? And you're not paying people bonuses to stay that you would be better off if they would move along. So we want to pay attention to these retention strategies, but they have to be coupled. What has to come first is knowing who's effective and who isn't. Kansas does not require a state-dictated salary schedule, but what we know, and what you've already heard reference to today, is that pretty much every district, not just in Kansas, but in the country, bases its salary schedule on two things: advanced degrees and years of experience. Now, we've already talked a little bit about advanced degrees, but when you look at these salary schedules, they're not just based on degrees, they're based on credit accumulation, right? So there are, I have seen schedules with more than a dozen steps. So the first one is for your master's degree, then your master's degree plus 30, then master's degree plus 60, master's degree plus 90, 2 master's degrees, a PhD. What do you need 140 degrees above, 140 credits above your master's degree for? Like, it's not grounded in anything that makes any sense. And you can't blame teachers for accumulating these credits. It's their only way to increase their salary beyond years of experience, which you can't speed that up. You can't age any faster. You can't, make the world spin. So the only thing you can do to increase your salary that's within a teacher's control is do that coursework and increase those, accumulate those credits. So we are beginning to see, it's not enough here for the state to say, for the state not to have a salary schedule of its own, but the state really needs to be proactive here, like Indiana and Florida and Oklahoma have done, and say, districts, we're not going to tell you how to make your salary schedule, but it can't be based just on these two things without any consideration of performance. And the last one looks at performance pay. There are now 19 states that have some sort of performance pay program, but these really, really, really vary in terms of what they're rewarding, whether student achievement is really being rewarded for that. And I just want to say one other thing about performance pay. There's been a lot of studies showing that it didn't have any impact on student achievement in various settings. And I, for one, don't think that most teachers regularly show up saying, I'm going to bring my B game today. And if only there was an opportunity for some bonus pay, some performance pay, perhaps I'd bring my A game. Right? The idea behind performance pay isn't about incenting teachers to try harder. I just don't think that's what it's about. I know I was in the classroom for 9 years. I tried pretty hard most days. Maybe not every day, but most days. And I don't think that someone's saying, but if you just try harder, you might earn more money, right? That's not really going to incentivize teachers. But what performance pay does is it incentivizes people who wouldn't think about teaching to come into the profession because they're not bounded to this lockstep pay that says you and I are going to make the exact same salary regardless on how successful I am compared to you. So we need performance pay. We need to break away from these salary schedules so that we are rewarding our very best teachers and recruiting new talent into the profession. I'm not particularly discouraged by a study that shows performance pay didn't result in an increase in student achievement in the very short term, because I'm not sure that's what it's meant to do. Right? In the long term, we'd expect to see an increase in student achievement as we are attracting different folks in. Okay, so then switching gears a little bit to talk more about teacher preparation. How am I doing on time? So Arnie Duncan is, I could put lots and lots of quotes up here of people who are dissatisfied with the current state of teacher preparation as we know it. He referred to it as the Bermuda Triangle. Art Levine, who was the president of Teachers College in New York City, talked about it as Dodge City. Arnie Duncan also has another great quote about teacher preparation needs revolutionary change, not evolutionary tinkering. So here's the problem with teacher preparation in a nutshell. Every year, each state has to report to the federal government under the Higher Education Act specifically about the performance of teacher preparation programs. And not only are 99% said to be fine, but it's really like 99.9999999 something, because there are thousands and thousands of programs in the country, and only 17 in the most recent year were identified as low performing.
when we see this disconnect we know exists between what many of our teachers' performance and student performance, we have to look at teacher preparation. And just as it doesn't make sense that we have systems that say that 99% of teachers are satisfactory, right? What Tony said about the DNF schools, it just doesn't make sense. Excuse me. It doesn't make sense that all of our teacher preparation programs are perfectly excellent when the results that we're getting in schools look like. Now, that's not to say there aren't many that are excellent. I'm sure there are many, many that are excellent. But this data shows us we have a problem, and we need to really systematically rethink how we're looking at teacher preparation. This puts an even finer point on it. This data shows the lack, actually, this data don't show any difference between performance of traditionally certified teachers and alternatively certified teachers. This is math. This is student performance in math from Los Angeles. Now, some people look at this and say, well, then we don't need a traditional certification, right? Why don't we just put anybody in the classroom, and because it's all the same level of achievement anyway. Our point of view at my organization is, shouldn't it make a difference? You've had teacher candidates who have invested 2, in some programs, 3 years in learning how to teach. It should make a difference. So we need to take a look at what's actually going on in these programs. There have been lots of attempts to do this, really look at what's going on in these programs. My organization, oops, I think I did that. Slide out. Oh, it's forward backwards things are making me crazy. We have just launched the National Council on Teacher Quality in partnership with U.S. News and World Report, an attempt to look at every ed school in the country. The ed schools are not happy about it. Not happy about it one little bit. Most programs are refusing to provide us with the information that we need to look at their programs. We are pursuing open records requests and other vehicles we have to get the information, because to us it's just crazy that even if it's a private institution, it serves the purpose of preparing teachers to serve public school students, and therefore has a responsibility to the public. Many states have a push towards accountability, looking at connecting student achievement back to teacher preparation programs. Louisiana, Florida, and Tennessee are the farthest along on this. And this is really, really important and very, very necessary. But all that data is going to tell you is that this program consistently outperforms that program. It's not going to tell you why. It's not going to tell you anything about what they do. So we really think, whether it's through our study, whether it's through state efforts, whether it's through what other organizations and entities do, we have to take a closer look at what's going on in these teacher preparation programs. And I'm going to show you a little bit about the things we're looking for. The four, broadly, who do you let into these programs? What does the content preparation look like? How do we make sure teachers know, as Tony said, that the chemistry teacher actually knows some chemistry? The professional preparation, right? It's not enough to know the chemistry. Do you know how to teach it and convey it to students in a manner that they really internalize and understand it? And then finally, who do you let out of your programs? So delving into each of these a little more, one of the big things in terms of how we let candidates into teacher preparation programs is that we can find pretty much in every state at least one program that's a wide open door. We'll take anybody. If you want to be a teacher in that state, there is a program that will accept you, whatever, regardless of your academic background. And what surprises us is that even where programs do have some standards and some requirements for entrance, they are generally notably different than what would be required for a non-education program. So think about graduate programs for a second, right? Most graduate programs, whether it's to study English literature or anything else, you have to take the GRE. The percentage of graduate education programs in the country that require the GRE is minuscule. We've seen institutions where the GRE is required for every single other graduate program in the entire institution except the education program. And when we do test teachers, for example, many states require teachers to take a a basic skills test for admission to the teacher preparation program, and that seems like it's on the right track. Except that the basic skills test that's used is part of the Praxis series combined with, that's part of the teacher licensure test. So it's only normed to the population that's planning to be teachers. So we know we're not getting the population that we want, yet we're setting norms that only draw from that population, right? There are plenty of other tests we could use that would compare the prospective teacher population to the general college-bound population, but most programs in the country don't require that. Texas actually is the only state that requires prospective teachers to pass a test that is normed to the general college-bound population. Oops, keep doing that, sorry. One of the things we know is that when we look at the highest performing countries in the world, the countries that typically and consistently outperform the United States on international comparisons, their admissions criteria look very different than ours do in terms of who they let into teacher preparation programs. In Finland, in Singapore, in South Korea, if you are not in the top 10%, in some cases the top third, of your high school graduating class, don't even think about a teaching career. You have no hope of getting into the program. In the United States, we are typically looking at the bottom 50%, right? So we're not even close to the top 10%, and maybe that's unrealistic for us to aspire to. But moving from the bottom 50% to the top 50%, that seems realistic to aspire to. I think I've already said everything on this slide. Got a little ahead of myself. And admissions, so we have got to look at who we are letting in. In terms of elementary teachers, this tracks with a lot of the things we've been talking about in terms of state teacher policy, making sure that programs prepare teachers to teach reading. When we look at what programs do on the reading front, I personally believe that science has shown how we teach young children how to read very effectively, and we know how to do that. Some people still think there are ideological debates around that. When we look at what programs are teaching in terms of teaching young children how to read, very few programs are teaching the reading science. But most of the time, what they're teaching instead isn't ideologically driven. It's not, we believe in whole language and not scientifically based reading, and so therefore that's what we're going to train our teachers. What most of the time we see is that what programs think their responsibility is to put teachers on a path to developing their own personal philosophy of reading and teaching reading. Imagine a medical school that operated that way, right? We're going to put prospective doctors on a path to developing their own personal philosophy of cardiac care. It doesn't make any sense. But that's what we do, what most programs do in terms of reading. We also see in terms of methods and classroom management that many programs, certainly not all, but many programs make no differentiation in that coursework between elementary teachers and secondary teachers. So I would think, right, we know that classroom management in a kindergarten classroom and in a high school classroom do not look the same, do not require knowledge of the same strategies. We also look at whether programs prepare elementary teachers with a broad liberal arts background. Do teach, we ask a lot of elementary teachers. We ask them to be able to touch on lots of different subject areas, and do they have the liberal arts background to be able to do that? In terms of middle school teachers, middle school teachers fall into two different categories. Some middle school teachers only teach a single subject, and other middle school teachers are generalists, right? They do still teach many subjects. We can't treat the preparation for those two as if they're the same. When we do, we don't make sure that they know all the subjects that they're going to be called on to teach. And then the other issues are the same about making sure they're getting grade-specific methods and classroom management. The same for secondary and science teachers. For secondary teachers. The big issue here is that although most states are pretty good about making sure that secondary teachers have passed a test in the subject that they're going to teach, there are huge loopholes in the area of science and social studies. Now, Kansas does not have the science loophole, but it does have the social studies loophole. So the science loophole is, again, these composite licenses that let you teach secondary specific science topics, even though you had a composite license. So on a composite license, I may have taken mostly biology, maybe a chemistry course. I've passed a composite test that had some chemistry on it, but not mostly. There's no assurance I know the content I have to teach, and now I can teach chemistry or physics on that composite license. Kansas wisely does not offer such a license, although most states do. But the same is true of social studies. At the secondary level, Kansas offers this broad history and government license. Now, those are two very different things. I want to know my history teacher knows history. I want to know my government teacher knows government. And unless there is a test that really lets you break those out in separate scores, and none of the praxis tests do that, you just don't know that you know the subject matter. And again, the same issues around methods and classroom management. In terms of preparation of special education, teachers, I'm not going to get back on my soapbox about the elementary and secondary issues, but what we see in a lot of special education programs is not only, you would think that if you were preparing to be a teacher of learning disabled kids, you'd get even more training in teaching reading than general ed teachers. We see programs where you get less. So the emphasis on effective reading instruction is so important. We know, the research couldn't be more clear, that it's about 80% of kids who are categorized as learning disabled, it has to do with difficulties learning how to read. Yet our special ed teachers aren't getting that firm background. We also see, when you look back at the original definitions and the original theory behind special education, what's supposed to put the special in special education is that the instruction is specially designed for the needs of special ed students. And we see little emphasis in the preparation of special education teachers on teaching teachers how to do that kind of instructional design. And then lastly, there is the exit criteria. So in a nutshell, what we see is that the only exit criteria that most programs require are the licensure tests. Well, I already showed you what's wrong with the licensure tests, right? The 16th percentile. So programs aren't setting any higher bar than what the state is demanding. So, as I said, we last produced our comprehensive report in 2009. In January, our new report on Kansas will be out. But we did issue last year a state-by-state blueprint of, if we were you, Kansas, here's what we do first. It also includes what we call some low-hanging fruit, right? Things that we think are relatively easy in the scheme of any policy change. Things that could be done that would make a big difference. I brought a couple of hard copies. I'll leave them with James if anybody wants to claim them, but it's also on our website, can be downloaded. And finally, here's my contact information, but I would be most happy to answer any questions.
So nothing she said was at all.
Ooh, everyone's worn out. I lost it with my soapbox.
I am curious about how Finland, Singapore, and Korea rank in getting teacher salaries compared to other countries.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the answer is they, without a doubt, pay more than we pay here in the United States. Teacher salaries are considerably higher. They are not drastically higher. When you look at pay scales in those countries, it's not that doctors and teachers are flipped. But it is, they do pay significantly more, but not dramatically more.
One of the things that I've researched over the years is the National Department of Education has a great area with statistics and everything else. You can find all kinds of information. One of the things I noticed in Dr. Bennett's presentation in Indiana only has 58% of the amount of dollars actually gets to the classroom. Kansas is actually about the same, or we used to be a little bit worse. The national average was like 61.5%, and that was as of 2006. How does this, what you're talking about here, how does it affect? Because people always say, well, we want the teachers to make more money. Well, that's fine, but when you're only putting 55 to 58% of the total dollars that we're spending on the public education into the classroom, which includes teacher salaries and benefits and supplies, that's the criteria they use. How do you make that happen? You got to change some basic policy structures of somewhere, don't you? Or is it just about teacher quality?
And well, no, it's certainly not just about teacher quality. I think, although I think, you know, there's a lot to be done on teacher quality. I think, you know, what Eric referred to this morning, when just talking for a second about Florida's third grade literacy plan and how they don't let kids go beyond third grade if they're not proficient readers, and what the supports they provide to kids who don't do that. When they passed that bill, and it looks like all sorts of new money went into that bill, when the reality is they sat down and looked at how things were being spent and just reallocated the existing dollars. There are really lots of you know, cold, hard conversations like that just aren't occurring either at the state level or at the district level. Like any public field, education suffers from let's just keep doing things how we've been doing them, and you know, maybe we'll get some new money, and if we do, we can talk about how to spend that money. But until then, we're not going to talk about how we're actually spending the dollars that we have, and those conversations absolutely have to occur. You know, you're not going to be able to make these kinds of fundamental changes. The other thing I'd add, although I know you were talking about the non-teacher part, and I didn't talk about it today, but we do include it in our report, is, you know, part of the teacher quality conversation has got to be pension reform, because a ridiculous amount of the dollars that go towards teacher salaries are going towards financially unsustainable pension systems. And we have to deal with them sooner rather than later. You know, the millennials, whatever, I'm showing my age, I can't think of what they're, isn't that what they're called? The millennials that have just entered the workforce, right, that have born in, no, I guess not born, I guess entering the workforce since the turn of the century. They don't expect to end their career in the job that they started. Far from it, right? They expect to have many, many different jobs over the course of their career. Yet in teaching, we're sticking to a system that backloads all the benefits. We'd be able to raise salaries quite a bit, especially at the front end. And I'm certainly not saying do away with teachers' pensions, right? Retirement savings is critically important, but we have things backloaded in a way that are a huge disincentive to young teachers, both to enter the profession and to stay if they don't see themselves staying, you know, for the long haul. So there's lots of things that need to be looked at.
In Wichita, our state's largest district, I think almost 50,000 students. there have been, and it's real hard to get information about this, so I can't be quite accurate, but from 200 to 300 of what they call instructional coaches. These are teachers who don't have a classroom, but instead coaching, I guess, is the word. I mean, the district is very vague, and we haven't really pressed them. I guess maybe we should, as to what these people do. So my question would be, are these instructional coaches that aren't principals and they aren't teachers, is this a common practice across the country? And then second of all, perhaps the most important question is this practice effective in helping teachers become better teachers?
Yeah, so I think the answer, like so many things, is it's effective if it's done really well, and we have every reason to think there are as many places where it's not done well as it is, as where it is done well. I mean, if you look at a model like Florida's literacy instruction, literacy thing, which is called Just Read Florida, that puts a highly trained reading coach into every building that works with the teachers and builds the skills of the teachers, and you cannot go into a building and not be dazzled by the value that that coach adds to that to the instruction that goes on there. But you can just as easily walk into a building and find that the person who's supposed to be the coach might be very talented, but is seen as the person without a class, and therefore, oh, you can cover Miss Jones' class today, you can cover bus duty, you can cover lunchroom. They don't get to do that. The other thing that you see, the worst end of the spectrum, is where these are seniority-driven positions. The principal has no say in making sure that a talented person gets them. It is the person with the most seniority who is entitled to the position, and that is not a recipe for making them useful positions. I think, I'm not going to say you can walk into a building and easily tell whether the coaches are adding value or not, but I think it's pretty easy to tell. What exactly are their responsibilities? What do the teachers that coach is working with think of those responsibilities? Do they have a clear portfolio? And do they have the training and skills to be able to add something, or are they just randomly selected, in which case why would we expect that to be of any value?
We've heard a lot about classroom size, the importance. Could you speak to that?
Yes.
I realize on elementary it might be more important in the earlier grades, but do you see any negative qualitative returns on teachers when they increase from maybe 21 to 26 or something?
Yeah, that's a great question. I used to open my presentations with a graph, then I switched to that achievement gap one because that was so much more spot on. But I could, if we were to graph expenditures on K-12 over the last 30 years, it would be going like this. And if we graphed class size over that, it would be going in the opposite direction. We have steadily reduced class size. And if we overlaid NAEP, the national NAEP scores on that, it would be almost perfectly flat, some very almost imperceptible bumps. So we're spending more, we're bringing class sizes down, and we're not getting any return on it. The research is really, really strong and clear. Class size, unless you are going to reduce class sizes in the elementary grades down to 11, 12, 13 students, there is no return on it. And the kinds of, we spend, Florida, when they had an amendment to their state constitution reducing class size, spent, I think the number is like $4 billion. When you reduce class size that dramatically, you need to bring in all these new teachers without, who carry all this baggage that we're talking about. There is study after study after study that shows when you reduce class size from 24 to 22, from 22 to 20, there is no bang for the buck in it. The problem is, to both teachers and parents, class size sounds like the smartest possible way to spend your money. Who doesn't want their kid in the smallest possible class, right? It's just, from a parenting perspective, so it is tough policy to raise class size, but the research is just unequivocal, unless you are getting down to those really small numbers, which we almost never are when we talk about class size reduction. There just isn't a return on it.
If I could tag on with that thought. Okay, we just saw all of these slides on how much better Florida performance is. So if Florida reduced their class sizes.
Oh, that's just in the last few years. Sorry, and there is data. I can't tell you off the top of my head how they did it, but there is data that shows Florida isn't getting none of the bang for the buck is coming from the class size reduction in Florida, mostly because all that money bought minuscule reductions in student-teacher ratios.
Thank you. I remembered my other question. I think this year in the legislature, unless I missed something, the only major issue related to teacher quality was, in some cases, the teacher probationary period before tenure is granted could change from 3 years to 5 years under some circumstances. So that's all we accomplished. So I would ask you, since we have quite a few legislators here, if we could just do one thing next year about improving teacher quality that is under the state's control, what one thing would you recommend the legislature does?
So from my perspective, it all rises and falls on that ability to know who's effective and who's not effective in terms of whether or not kids are learning in the classroom. So whether or not, I would say it's requirements that districts have evaluation systems that are putting student growth, student achievement at the center of it. And I just want to also put a point on something Tony said earlier. It's hard to imagine that Kansas is going to suddenly have a statewide evaluation model, right? That every district in the state here's how you must evaluate every teacher in the state. Like that's probably not very realistic. But if you go down this path, I think the state does want to think about developing a model that districts could use if they don't have the capacity to develop it for themselves, which most don't. So you're not getting in the way of anybody who does have that capacity and does have that desire to build their own system. Right? This is tough stuff to balance, how you're going to measure growth and how you're going to measure subjects and grades that don't have tests associated with them, and improving the observation rubric so it's really getting at stuff that matters. And so without stepping on districts' toes, you can still put a model out there, like Indiana plans to do, that says, you don't want to build this yourself, you don't have to.
Hi, I'm a product of the Kansas schools, and one of the best teachers I ever had ended up being a principal in a very small school, or a superintendent in a small school district where a total population in Crawford County of 38 to 40,000. We have 5 school districts. And so it seems to me that the number of school districts draws off some of our very quality teachers, because this same teacher that I had was available to teach high school for my daughter the first session in school every day. So she gave up band because she went to this teacher for her algebra, and she's very good at algebra. That I thought it was a shame that we lost him to an administrative position in a small district when he was such a talented teacher.
So I am definitely no expert on the ins and outs of consolidation issues. I will definitely leave that to other people. But what we do know is, it's sort of the flip side of the class size reduction is you put a few more kids in front of a really talented teacher, and more kids have benefited. And we have to look at mechanisms that can do that, and distance learning and online programs are one way that we expand that ability. But the other thing is we have to look at how we get our best talented teachers to want to stay in the classroom, that their career advancement shouldn't be that you leave the classroom, right? Everyone in that district wishes that person didn't become an administrator. And I'm certainly not suggesting that the motivation was money, but the motivation was career advancement, right? And the only way we let teachers the only way we let them advance is right out of the thing we think they do best. So what needs to go hand in hand with differentiating among teacher performance is making sure we have incentives that whether it's pay, whether it's career ladder, whether it's, let's marry these things together. The teacher who's awesome, maybe we're going to let her spend 1 year out of the classroom as a coach, right? Maybe that needs to be a revolving position where we don't lose her permanently from the classroom, but she gets a break, she gets to do something else, she gets recognized, all the other teachers benefit, and then she goes back in the classroom and someone else takes that role the following year. So we have been remarkably uncreative and not looked at ways to make these things better. But to think that our best teachers are going to stay in the classroom year after year doing the same, unrecognized. They do want to do something else. They do want to be recognized.
Thank you very much.